Welcome to the Warfare Parenting Podcast. I'm Laine Lawson Craft, here to walk with you through the ups and downs of parenting prodigals. In every episode, we're going to get real about the struggles, sharing stories of hope, and learning how faith can turn things around. So let's dive in and discover the path to healing and hope together. Welcome to the Warfare Parenting Podcast. I'm so excited you have joined us today. We are really going to dig deep into a wonderful book I've read cover to cover. It's called Unconditional: How a Mother's Love Rescued Her Rebellious Son. It's by Suzanne Roragen. And what really touched me in this book is the reminder none of us are alone. And we are in a battle for our children. And today we're going to go into all about Suzanne's, I'll call it Suzanne a memoir, because it's reflecting back being a mother. And welcome, Suzanne.
Well, thank you, Laine. I sure appreciate it. Yes, I definitely wrote it as a memoir, which is this period in time that are often great insights and a different kind of a how-to book.
Yes. And I often say looking back is 2020, isn't it?
Oh, I love looking back. Hey, I should have done that.
Well, I want to say this is all about your son, Nick. And
Uh-huh.
and about the relationship basically from infant to adult. And you cover a lot. You've got to get the book. I am just going to pull out some highlights that really spoke to me. I want to ask you one question, though. At what point did you decide to share this story about Nick's rebellion?
Wow. So there were kind of several key points along the way. One, do I turn this from a journal into a book? And then, okay, well, I'll have that memoir just for me and my son. And then after my husband read it, he was cringing at the end, but everybody's gonna have to get the book to see why he was cringing. But he was just cringing at the end, and he just was tearing up, and he said, "This thing has to be read by more people because I think that a lot of people could benefit from your journey." And so we said, "Well, if it's God's will, then let's do it." So we tracked down through kind of a mutual connection, someone at Forefront Books who said yes, because it's timely in, the struggles that people are having that are so different now in raising their children. And so he wanted more content on that. And he said, sure, we're going to publish this. And so when he said that, we were like, we're off and running. And then the next issue was, well, should we publicize it and get on podcasts and do things like that? And I said, why write it? Why be this vulnerable? Why, if we can't impact the most amount of people possible? So it was that kind of journey. And I guess we're just waiting for God to just kind of open doors.
And he really has. And that kind of talking about timely, we are seeing more suicides in the young generation than we've ever seen before. And I want to go back to a very early experience y'all had as parents when I believe it was your friend's son, Bobby's son,
Yes, yes,
committed suicide at, I believe it was age 11.
yes,
So
yes.
I want to really talk about that because that impacted you as a mother. That really kind of was what you used from that point on as you parented Nick, right?
It was subconscious, and I sure, in retrospect, something that traumatic should have gotten help. I mean, I outlined it in the book because it was such a key piece, and I even spoke in retrospect, thinking, "Oh, I better make sure my cousin's okay with this." That was her journey, her stepson, essentially. And I mean, an 11-year-old, and what was this, the 90s, before all the social media and everything? How did he know that was an answer for the way out? And so all of that, certainly, and I encourage everyone, get a good therapist for your children or for yourself so that you could be a better parent. But walking into the scene of what had happened the day after and just seeing all of that, I didn't understand how traumatic it was. And so, of course, we just held our son a little tighter that whole next day, but he was still, under 1 year old. And so it just got me, as all parents do, we go in and make sure they're still breathing. We put our ear down to their mouth and nose and make sure, and first time moms. But for me, it just amped it up. Don't ever let him be upset because he may not tell me when he's upset, because this was the perfect child. Straight A's, honor roll, lots of friends, really apparently well adjusted, got along great with his parents, was very compliant, just a great boy. He was nice he really had a nice little relationship with my son. And I'm like, there was no red flag. So there was no red flag there. How am I going to know my son's okay? And I think that was kind of a don't push him too far. There may be, we've got guns in the house. And that always kind of ran under the surface.
Well, particularly in the teen years when y'all were really starting the struggles of parenting, Nick,
Yeah.
that remembrance kind of guarded and guided the way you did things, right?
Yeah, I think like I said again, subconsciously, but even sometimes it would come into the forefront of, when he was upset or angry and he's like, "Oh, I'm just going to shoot myself." You know how kids do. Or I'm just going to shoot something, or, it was always because he was a hunter. He's going to go shoot something. And that just put me on high alert. So,
Yeah, and that kind of leads me up to my next question. I would love for you to share today one of the darkest periods with Nick. I mean, what can you describe one of your major struggles as you look back with Nick?
oddly, there weren't a lot of major struggles, at least in the rearing. There were smaller episodes where we came to blows and, senior in high school, that sort of thing, where I didn't have a sense of control of his actions and couldn't stop him finding the car keys and going out and driving. So there were those sorts of things that happened that were very scary.
Talking about
But
like with the alcohol and all of that, he, at one point was doing all of that. That
so I think oddly, the last sort of point, the breaking point as you're reading the book, was when he dropped his phone while he was being arrested. So I had the privilege of witnessing the most horrific thing I've ever heard in my life
mm,
on the other side of the phone, 2,500 miles away, helpless.
yes.
And that was the darkest moment that actually led to, sort of our stepping out of the whole dark season.
Yes.
But it was horrific, sitting there at 2 in the morning or whatever time, that maybe it was even just midnight, but sitting there on the other end of the phone, unable to do anything.
Well, I often say, Suzanne, that when I was raising three teenagers, I used to dread the 1 and 2 and 3 a.m. calls.
Yeah.
I mean, I would literally, my stomach would just drop to the floor
Uh-huh.
every time because there were too many of them.
Too many.
And one of that when I read that in your book, I just, again, it's unconditional, how a mother's love rescued her rebellious son. I could really relate. I thought, I get it. I get it. And
Yeah.
a lot of phone calls from police myself, and it's just a terrible place for a mama's heart, isn't it?
Well, my heart goes out to you that you had 3, and so you had more chance of that happening. But I think, there were so many things. You're just in, survival mode at that point. It's just like, what do we do? You're just so busy putting out fires, you don't know what to do. You don't
Right.
know who to turn to. I turned to, as many resources as I could. They have a great system on most campuses for wellness programs. So I turned to that. They had great therapists in town, and I turned to that. There were threats to bring him home, but I think once they're in the heart of that rebellion, it's a heart issue.
It is.
Do you see that it's kind of like their hearts are already hard
Yes.
to the light, and I see it as the light of Jesus.
Yes.
I say their hearts aren't ready for that. If I brought him back here, if I brought him anywhere at that point, it was too late to really see an effect. We had to do something drastic, an epic fail had to happen, and indeed that's sort of what happened.
Well, it's interesting you say about a heart issue because I often tell parents one of the best things you can do is ask God to touch their heart because only
Yes,
God can touch their heart. And when He does, you can have an instant change, and a sudden change.
a sudden
So,
change.
yes. And so, if you're listening today and you've got a prodigal or a wayward child or a child that's just rebellious, we would both tell you start praying for God
to touch their hearts.
Yeah, and it's really a misnomer on my title because I didn't rescue my rebellious son. God rescued my rebellious son.
Yeah.
But I stayed in the fight, and that's one of my key messages for parents is stay in the fight. I had a lot of, which is, I think, makes it my perspective unique and I think maybe a little more credible to write the book because I had a front row seat because of the closeness I've always had with my son. He couldn't stop sharing, based on how close we were as a military family and us, always sort of the two of us since he was an only child doing all of these transitions together. So even when he was doing horrible things, he couldn't stop sharing. And
Right.
so I had an insight and I wasn't able to put the blinders on because I wasn't going to not take the phone call. I wasn't going to, stop the information. And so things would come my way and I had this insight and I had friends that their children, I knew what their children were doing because they were doing them with my son. Because these rebellious children, I don't know if you found, they're going to find other kids that are feeling that rebellion in that way. There's different ways to rebel. You see high achievers and they may turn inward. And that's kind of one of the points in my book. They may do a lot of self-harm. So I don't know that that's any less dangerous, that sort of self-harm, as what you might see with these teen boys that are out there with drugs and alcohol. I think all of these kinds of ways of, surviving, rebelling, trying to process are all dangerous. But, ultimately, I saw what was going on. I wasn't able to put the blinders on like my friend's son, my son's friends, and that gave me insight to write this book.
Well, it's interesting you should mention the military because I put here as a military spouse, you moved so many times and even out of the country. And I asked, what impact do you think this had? I have that he went to 7 schools in 9 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that had to have an impact on him.
Yeah, and he had to repeat a grade because of just the age and the timing of different school systems. So there was a lot of shame with him having to repeat a grade. Hey, couldn't I make it? No, he was a really great student. He was quite intelligent. But so there was a lot of that. So the impact, I think, ultimately was the variability in the school systems and the quality of the education. At one point, having a long duration in a poor quality school system caused him to try less hard, to kind of fall asleep, if you will, in class when the content wasn't useful, when he's, I got that, 30 minutes ago. And the teacher would kind of spend more time with the students that were struggling. And I think we see that more and more now in the school system as they're integrating, sort of a lot of special need kids, and that's pulling that attention away, which is a whole other issue, why I advocate for whatever schooling your child needs if they're not thriving, which we didn't do. But he took a step back in class, became less interactive, became more accepting of the B scores or the C scores instead of going extra hard for the A's. But I think ultimately the biggest thing was that he just wanted to fit in.
Yes. Yes.
Because it was, let's go to this school, 2 years here, you made some best friends, now it's time to go. Let's go to this new school, you made some best friends, now it's time to go. And so, just that was so difficult not having a sibling to always have that best friend. He was left, listen, I just want to go and be accepted.
Yes.
And that's ultimately what happened. And he found a group that accepted him wholeheartedly during his rebellious phase. And so they were all in, he was all in, and it worked great for them.
Well, let me ask you, talking about the rebellious period, if you could tell us today one strategy that you used when you were trying to create boundaries, trying to reel him back in, would you share something that maybe worked well for you for the other parents listening today?
A strategy to reel him back in once he was kind of in the thick of it gets really tough. I think the strategy I tried to use that I think will be successful for many people, and indeed we did have some success with it, is to create a community. And the boundary is, I think, in terms of what that looks like as a boundary, is I'm watching you. we're a group and we've got eyes on you. And if you cross a certain line or if you do certain things, we know where you are, what you're doing. And, we care about you, we love you, and we're not going to let you, head toward those epic fails. So creating friendships with these parents, meeting with them and saying, I see these things happening, or calling, hey, are the boys at your house? Or, I mean, even later having that happen and, hey, I'm going to take the car keys away. Make sure your son doesn't come by and pick my son up because he's grounded. So that's what would happen ultimately. I would create these boundaries and these rules. And he would, at that point, I think once they're in that rebellious heart that we spoke about, you're not really that effective as a parent at that point. And that's kind of what happened with us. So he would just climb out the window. So then I got into stalker mode, kind of, once or twice a night, making sure he was in bed because he had all sorts of ways to turn off his iPhone finder. So having that community of people, hey, is your son in bed? Or, we had a friend text one time at midnight and my son was actually home. And so she had some concerns about her son who might have been driving drunk. And I think I relayed that in the book. But just having that connection.
Yes. And I love that because sometimes we're hesitant because we feel shame or embarrassed.
Yeah.
Our kid is out of control. But if they're hanging out with another kid, the likelihood of him being out of control is probably pretty good. And so I love that strategy. I love that strategy about being bold and courageous and calling these parents and saying, hey, look, can we agree to be friends through this? And let's make sure they don't get, too much in trouble. Right.
Yeah, and I had early on, I wrote about it in the book, one mom who I think I specifically mentioned, who I should have modeled in middle school. She had a handle on it because she was a boy mom. She had some boys and, she was all about the little league and she'd been in this town forever and she knew all about this. And so in 8th grade, she called me up and she said, what are you doing? Have you got a strategy for taking car keys? And are you checking for this and that? And I'm like, what are you talking about? So she had a handle on it early on the community outreach.
And that's great. And I was going to say, I know you and Nick were friends, but I often say you can't be best friends with your child and be an effective parent. Do you agree to
No.
that statement?
Oh, absolutely. And your parent and your child shouldn't necessarily be your best friend until they're adults as well, obviously. Then you can probably move into that relationship. But it was a toggling back and forth. One minute we're, hanging out and we're shopping and we're laughing and we're having fun as, most people do with their children, going to concerts together and, various things like that. But, I don't think there was ever a question that he knew who was in charge. And there were moments when he disrespected me that were some other dark moments, but that wasn't him. And that's how I knew that the enemy had kind of moved in and taken over his spirit, because that was not my son. And these are things that you can pray fervently if you're a praying person for your child and never cease praying, get others to pray for them. That is, I think, your biggest tool. Early on, obviously, is God having a seat at your table? Are you bringing your child to a position, early on, if it's still, middle school or less than that? Do they know where to turn in the Bible when they're having an issue, so that when you aren't, relevant anymore, that they have their own way of finding out where their moral compass is, and just seeing those signs when their hearts are hardening and stop the self-arrest, for them,
Yes.
that they can see when their hearts are hardening.
Well, that leads me to, where did faith play for you as a parent? What part did it play?
Well, it was developing. We were sort of the family that grew up in church, and then, God wasn't really necessary unless you had like, oh, you're on the side of the road, you got a flat tire. Oh, Lord, help me, as more of that kind of praying person. Easter, we'd, all gather around and say a prayer and whatever special meal it was and go to church. But I didn't have an intimacy with God. I didn't lean on my faith. And even now, when it's so strong, it's still hard to lean on your faith all the time. You still want to lean on yourself. So I would have to say it was developing over this. And I think God was using this and allowing this time to happen so that I could develop a faith. Hey, this isn't your child. I have loaned him to you to take care of for me. And so I need to do a good job with this. And I wish I had seen that. But ultimately, the CEO of our company had prayed for him. He'd come over to visit our store that we had here in town and said, "What can I pray for?" And I mentioned my son and how he was struggling. And I know the CEO prayed for him, and he specifically said, "Let me get his name." And 2 days later, that whole episode I just mentioned to you sort of just exploded, and the road became not smooth because there was a lot to do, and he didn't stop, but his heart softened. God turned his heart from stone to mush, sort of. And there was a lot of other things, still obviously there's a lot with a 19, 20-year-old boy. Their brains aren't fully formed, so you're still going to have issues. But I think the faith really was, oh my God, prayer works. And when we include other people that are strong prayer warriors that sort of maybe have a better hotline than we do, then we engage that. And my faith was like, wow.
That is so
And then it's just been a journey. I don't think we ever reach a pinnacle. I think it's always a journey. I mean, even the most seasoned Christians say, oh my gosh, what did I just do? I wasn't relying on God here. So it's just an ongoing daily journey. But I know how to do the journey now. And
Yeah.
it started with the CEO's prayer.
Wow. Listen, I want to ask you, we're getting down to the end. I can't believe it. Looking back, is there anything you can look back and say, I would have done differently to someone that's listening today? Is there a nugget you can look back on and say, I wish I would have maybe done this?
I do. I do wish I wouldn't have put so much importance on him developing friendships and fitting in and that whole, overflow of being a military family. Put the emphasis on, if you can, being a person of faith, if you are, put that emphasis on that relationship. Put the emphasis on family, faith, and those sorts of things that are foundational.
And we'll
Um,
always
that will
anchor.
always be there, that
Yeah.
are his anchor. But
Yes.
when I was putting that emphasis on, well, we need to have the right friends. I'm not going to pull you out of that friend group. I'm not going to do the tough thing, which I encourage parents, do the tough thing when you see, these shifts in your children. And I didn't do that tough thing, pulling them away from that friend group. And I had a friend who, found out her son was with a bad group of people. She completely forbade any kind of interaction with that friend group. And he was maybe a freshman in high school. And she's like, no, you're not going to hang out with them. Well, he ultimately went on to find another friend group, Christian fellowship athletes, and got on a row team and a crew team, and, ultimately just moved away from all that. So, I wish I had done a tougher thing instead of just putting so much importance on his acceptance outside my home.
That is so good. Listen, again, everybody, it's Unconditional. The name of the book is Unconditional: How a Mother's Love Rescued Her Rebellious Son. Suzanne, real quickly, where can we get the book
Mhm.
and how can we connect with you?
Okay, that's a great question. SuzanneJRoragen.com is my website. And there's a link to the book there, or you can go straight to Amazon and grab the book there. And we're looking into an audio copy, so that will be available soon on my website. But then that's where you can get the book, and then you can follow me on social media, Unconditional Suzanne, and Suzanne J. Roragen on Facebook.
It's a beautiful book, y'all. It's a hardback book. It's not only beautiful, but there is such a great way to look back and understand all the steps. And real quickly, Suzanne, is there anything that you would like to say before we end today?
Gosh, I would just say, number one, don't be afraid to be vulnerable and to share your journey with other people. Number two, find out who you're allowing in your home in terms of, is it God? Is it culture? Well, who's ruling the house? And am I too excited to be accepted and not face judgment, that's more important than what I know to be true as a parent and good foundational morals. So I really encourage parents to do the tough thing to make sure that they are sort of the head of their household in terms of their children.
That is so great. Again, Unconditional, How a Mother's Love Rescued Her Rebellious Son. Go get your copy today. Y'all know I love you, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining me on the Warfare Parenting Podcast. I hope you're leaving with a heart full of hope and some spiritual strategies to help your wayward child and bring your prodigal home. Remember, you're not alone in this journey, and with God, everything can change. I invite you to the many free resources at LaineLawsonCraft.com. Don't forget to read the free chapter, the first chapter of my newest book, The Parent's Battle Plan, and sign up for weekly encouraging emails too. Stay in touch on social media and don't forget to subscribe. I'm Laine Lawson Craft, reminding you with love and faith, no thing is too hard or big for our God. See you next time.